In this series of videos, you'll learn everything you need to know to get started in the world of Adobe Animate. Let's do it.
TipTut.
Part 1. Basic Animation and Setup. Hello everybody and welcome back to TipTut. Today we're starting a new journey inside of Adobe Animate 2020. Now I know I've done a few intro to Adobe Animate series, but if I'm perfectly honest, I keep coming back to it because I'm never really happy with them. Additionally, Adobe Animate has had a ridiculous update for 2020 and there's loads of cool stuff you can do. The most important thing for me is the new brush engine, which works really well, much better than the previous one. So I thought what I'd do is take another sort of dive into the world of animation and show you guys how to use Adobe Animate 2020. We're going to be recreating the animation you saw in the beginning. But what I won't be diving into is like the principles of animation, frankly, because I'm not very good at them. I will link in the description a series that has a fantastic expert opinion on things like squash and stretch and stuff like that, that I recommend you watch. If you want to get used to the software, learn some basic animation, get started, then this is the series for you. So we're going to go from the ground up, and all I've done here is just open up Adobe Animate. And the first thing we're going to do is create our canvas. Now, you can download a sketch from my website, which I will link for you now. Using this sketch, you can follow along what we're doing. And the size I'd recommend you work out is either 1920 by 1080 or 2560 by 1440. Now, it doesn't actually really matter because Adobe Animate works in vector rather than raster, which means that the shapes and things you create are based on mathematical equations rather than actual pixels being painted in with color, which means it's infinitely scalable. But it's best to start, you might as well work in the native resolution you're going to be working at. Let's leave it at 24 frames per second, which is the classic animation frame rate, even though we'll learn about working on 2s later, which actually means it's 12 frames per second, but that's very boring. And when you hit create, you'll be opened up to this interface here. Now, if at any point in this tutorial series you don't see any of the windows that I see, you can find them under the Windows panel here. But I am working from the Essentials default workspace, so you should be fine. Go up to your zoom in window here and just choose fit in window. You can hold control and zoom in and out with the scroll wheel, which is what I do, or control plus and minus. And we'll just explain briefly what these parts of the interface are before we get to any animation. You've got your tool panel down the left, and we'll explore these in detail, so I won't go too far into it now. You've got normal things like your brushes, erasers, your shape tools, paint buckets, fills, eyedroppers, all that sort of stuff. Then you have your properties panel, which basically is where you'll be spending most of your time. This has got the same as the rest of the Adobe suite now, where it updates depending on what you have selected. It's quite useful and comprehensive. Next to that, you should have your library, where it's going to store all of your symbols and things like that, which we'll get to later on. And to the right, you'll have your various control panels, most important of which is color, swatches, transform, align, all that sort of stuff. Down at the bottom here, you've got your timeline, and this is where you're going to set up your animation. But apart from that, your big white area is your canvas, and that's all you really need to get started. So the first thing we're going to do is import our sketch. I'm just going to take the sketch from the website and drag and drop it over our canvas, and it will load it into your canvas area for you automatically. You'll also notice that if you go to your library now, you're going to have a PNG inside that library, which you can recollect that asset from later on. I'm just going to put my phone over there so it doesn't distract us any further. With this imported now, it's going to fill in this little dot down here, which you noticed on the timeline. Now, there's a basic way of remembering and working in Animate is everything you do is drawn on a frame. Okay, so if you understand what basic animation is, it's actually a lie. It's a series of still images placed one after each other very quickly to simulate the idea of motion, which doesn't actually take place. The way you control that simulation of motion inside of Adobe Animate is with your timeline down here. So if I just drag us a little bit of extra space, anyone working in any other Adobe software will understand the idea of layers, and anyone who's done a bit of After Effects will understand the fact that things change over time based on keyframes and stuff that you drop in. The way Adobe Animate works is there are basically two types of frame. There is a keyframe and there is a normal frame. Now, a keyframe is what you want to use when you want any change in animation. So if I'll just delete this for now because we can bring it back later. If I just draw with my brush tool a basic shape, okay, would help if I turned my graphics tablet on. There we go. If I just draw a basic shape, this circle, okay, you can see that we have a layer here with a frame here with a dot in it. And if I select that dot, it's going to highlight what we have drawn. Now, I can create extra frames of content here to make this drawing last longer. And you can do that by right-clicking and choosing Insert Frame, or you can just hit the shortcut F5. If I press, just do it, say, let's do it at 1 second in length, so I can remove those extra frames to have 1 second of animation here. If I hit enter, which is the button for previewing the animation, you'll notice that nothing changes because that frame is being repeated over and over again, and it's only taking that last keyframe, which is what we've got on frame 1. If I were to insert a new keyframe, the shortcut for which is F6, or a new blank keyframe with nothing on it, which shortcut is F7, you'll notice that that frame, the content on that frame disappears. So I'll just do that again. I select the frame I want. I hit F6. That will duplicate the last frame. It'll basically turn whatever was onto here onto a new keyframe. And if you hit F7 or delete it, it will turn it into a blank keyframe. Now, if I draw a different image and I add in some more normal frames, let's go to 48 with F5. You'll notice that when I play, that circle turns to a square when the next keyframe is struck by that timeline header. That's all it is. That's all animation is. Changing that image at a point in time. Now, of course, that's very, very simple, very, very easy. What we're going to do is using our sketch that we imported in earlier, we're going to recreate this entire scene and do this entire animation. So how are we going to do that? We're basically going to do it with a series of complicated layers and symbols inside of which they're their own little unique looping animations to bring together a huge animation. So basically what I'm saying is follow along and things will start to make sense as we get deeper into the software. Try not to be intimidated at the start by everything that you see in front of you. So first things first, you've seen what the final product looked like. If you go up to your swatches palette in the top right hand corner, you'll notice you'll have a default selection of colors. What I did was create my own little folder from the colors that were in that image, which you can also download from my website. And I just, using my eyedropper tool, which is the letter I clicked the color that I wanted on the image, and you can see that turns it to white over here. I went to my swatches panel and I hit new, and you can see it adds a new swatch. And then I just dragged that into its own folder. Okay, that's all I did. And I use that just so I can quickly select all these different colors that we're going to need. Now, what I'm also going to do is probably open up that swatches palette and just drag and drop it so that it's a floating window. And I'm going to close down the default swatches because we don't need them. I'm just going to make it nice and small and pop it in the right hand corner at the top, just so that we can work from it directly. Alternatively, you can drag it to below your library or properties panel, so it's always over here, or even above it might be more useful for you. Just depends however you want to work. So let's zoom out by hitting show frame on our zoom panel here, and let's start to think about how we're going to deconstruct this image that we've got here. We can see we're working in sort of 3 planes of existence. We've got the foreground where we have these large trees and this bird. We have the midground where we have these hills and the sort of river running down to the ocean where we have the background of our content. Now, we're actually going to be using a lot more than 3 layers, but for now, let's just understand that these might be our basic layers. So I'm going to go down to my layers palette here, and I'm just going to click the plus button a few times. And I'm going to make sure that we name all of our layers. It's very important. So I'm going to double click on this one and call it sketch. I'm actually going to probably, let's leave that on the bottom for now. And I'm going to click the padlock to lock it. On the layer above that, we're going to build our layers as we go rather than building all at the start, just so we know we don't have a load of extraneous layers lying around. And we're going to work on the trees first because that seems the most logical thing to me, is to start with the easy stuff. Alternatively, you can work backwards up, which is another way. So you could do the sky first and keep drawing things in front of it. We might do it that way actually, because that makes more sense from a construction point of view. So that's what we'll do first. We'll double click and we'll rename this layer sky. Now, what I like to do is just select a large portion of my timeline here and just hit F5, just so that it looks like we've got some frames to work with, even if there's no animation going on at the moment. Let's select our sky layer. I'm going to go up to my color palette and I'm going to choose a layer for the sky. Now, just on my other screen, just so that I recreate this in the same style as the original, I'm just going to bring up this reference image that I've got created here, just so I get it looking somewhat like what you saw in the beginning. And on the first frame of my animation here, I'm just going to hit B to bring up my brush tool. Now, one thing I have done is there are two types of brush in Adobe Animate. There is the classic brush, which you can see here, which has fairly limited sort of controls over it. As you can see, you've got size, you've got smoothing, and that's about it. If you hit Shift B, however, that will bring up the fluid brush, which you can see is the new brush engine in Adobe Animate. You can control things like size, stability, how much it smooths and rounds out angles, whether or not you want the brush to taper off, all sorts of things like that. I recommend using this brush. It's much better, much smoother, and as you can see, you create really nice, beautiful lines with it. An interesting shortcut is open and close square bracket, which will increase and decrease the size of your brush, and hitting Control plus and Control minus will zoom you in and out. So if you hit Shift B to bring up your brush, first thing we're going to do is just paint in the sun here. So what I'm going to do is grab my sort of normal dark red color from that palette. Yeah, that seems about right. And we're just going to see if we can get used to drawing with the brush. So I'm just going to start drawing out a rough circle. Now, obviously, if there's a bit that's under another layer, you're never going to see it, but you might choose to animate that differently later on. So I just hit Control Z there because I wasn't quite happy with the line that I draw. So maybe we can zoom out a little bit. And we can just start to roughly eke out what we want. Now, I'm using a graphics tablet. You can draw with a mouse. I highly recommend, highly recommend seeing if you can get a graphics tablet. You can get them for quite cheap nowadays. If I bring up K, hit K on my keyboard, that brings up the paint filler, and I can just fill in that shape that I've just drawn. Pressing Shift B will take me back to my fluid brush tool. Hitting V will bring up your selection tool, and you can use that to move things around. Hitting Q will bring up your transform tool, and you can use that to squash and scale things however you'd like. The usual Control Z, Control Y is undo and redo. So for example, I could undo that until it's back in the position that I want. Now, you can see here that in our original sketch, if I just bring that up, we've got these lines around the sun here, which kind of are static at the moment, but that's going to be our first bit of animation, mainly because it's really easy. And secondly, because it makes sense to do all this now, so you don't have to come back to it later. It'll also introduce us to the concept of symbols. So as you can see at the moment, we've just got our one shape here. Now, if we wanted to, we could go sort of to the next frame and hit F7. And we can start drawing our new picture. But as you can see, first of all, we can't see what our old frame looked like. So if we were to then move back and forth between frames using the comma and full stop keyframes, it'd be kind of hard to track what that's going to look like over time. That's where a really interesting tool called Onion Skin comes in, which is this sort of toggle option down here. If you turn that on, you'll notice you get this sort of new effect showing the previous and next frames in different colors. Now, if you find this distracting, you can right click on this and choose advanced settings and set these different things. Like, for example, I quite like them to be gray and sort of like a lighter gray for the next and previous frames. So we can do a little bit less distracting, basically. It's completely up to you. However, I think you can reset to default quite easily in the settings. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave previous on green and next on like a bright blue, just so it's easy for you guys to see what's going on in the video. So something like that is probably good for me. I'm also going to show the previous two. Oh God, excuse me. That was the automatic desktop bringing up there. The previous two and the next two frames is fine. And I don't really care about the starting opacity. We'll decrease by 20% each frame. Sure, that's fine. Okay. So now we can see what our previous and next frames look like. So we can use that as a guide for when we want to draw our next frame. Okay. However, we're not going to do it like this. What we're going to do is draw our first frame, make sure that we're completely happy with it. So I'm going to draw a nice circle. Now you could use the shape tool to do all this, but I quite like the natural sort of curve you get by doing it by hand. Then I'm going to click this shape and hit F8 or right click and convert to symbol. Now, any of you who are familiar with After Effects can think of a symbol like a pre-composition. For those who aren't familiar, you can think of a symbol as a normal timeline that you have contained inside a wrapper, and then that has its own timeline of animation. What this allows you to do is keep your main timeline really simple and neat so that you're not then fighting with yourself later on when you come to edit and adjust things. For now, just follow along and it'll make sense once we create a few more things. So I'm just going to call this graphic sun, and I'm going to make sure it's on type graphic. There is type movie clip and there is type button. I like to use graphic most of the time because it will preview when you hit enter, whereas movie clip won't. Buttons are for interactivity, which we're not having in this one. But you can apply different effects to a movie clip than you can to a graphic. So there's certain circumstances for each. I'm just going to call this one sun and hit OK. You can see now that it's surrounded by a blue box. And if I go to draw something new, it will create different shapes. Now, basic rule is if you've got a symbol on a layer, you want it to be by itself on that layer, just so that you can do things like tweening later on if you need to. Now you'll notice something clever. If I double click on this shape, our timeline changes completely and everything else sort of grays out a little bit, but also we go back to our editable shape. You can see at the top as well, we've got scene 1 and then the word sun. I can drop back to scene 1, which is outside of my symbol. And you can see we're back to our previous timeline as well. Double click to enter. Now, if we do our animation in here, because it's a graphic, if we did say 2 frames of animation, so I'm just going to hit F5 once, then on frame 3, I'm going to hit F7 and F5 again. That gives us 4 frames to work with, but this is that concept of working on 2s that I was talking about. You may have a 24 frame document, but working 12 frames per second, so 12 drawings per second is the classic way they do things for general animation. And then you can speed up to, a drawing every frame if you want to do something really detailed or flowing. If I draw now our next shape, and I kind of want these to stay in place, just maybe jitter a little bit. So I'm trying to trace this as accurately as I can. Remembering, of course, the ocean's going to be above the bottom, so that bit doesn't really matter. Hitting K to fill that in and B to go back to our brush. So now you can see we've got 2 frames. If I hit enter, they just sort of flip back and forth a little bit. Let's drop back out of our scene, and you can see that we've only got 4 frames of animation inside our symbol, but here we've got lots and lots of frames, almost 100. Good thing about symbols is they will loop forever if you start to play them, okay? What that means is when you're going back inside that symbol, you can do 2 frames, 3 frames, 4 frames of looping animation, and that will be reflected and respected in your main timeline. So I'm not quite happy with how this shape lines up with the previous one. So I can turn on, like flip back and forth between my onion skin. I can see that there's a bit at the top, just holding space there to pan around, by the way. There's a bit at the top that doesn't quite line up very nicely. You can see it's quite low there and quite high here. So if I hover over the edge of my shape, you'll see it will turn to this curved line. What you can do is you can actually squish and stretch after you've drawn. So I'm just going to bring that somewhat closer to where it was previously. Just going to start bringing these in like that. So that, yes, there is still a little bit of flicking, but not too much. Okay, that looks pretty good. So we'll just zoom back in. I'm going to add 2 more frames of animation to this. So F7, F5, and then F7, F5 again. 2 more frames of animation to this. Bring up my pen tool with B, and I'm just going to start to follow as closely as I can the original shape. Looks pretty good. And let's do that again for the last frame. There we go. Let's take a look at what that looks like. Okay, if we want to see that looping, you can turn on this loop option, which brings up the little 2 arrows here. You can drag them to cover the frames you want to loop, and then when you hit enter again, it will all loop in place. So you can see that first frame sort of jumps down a little bit. So what we're going to do on that first frame is bring in just a little bit more. Oops, that's a bit too much maybe. Just a little bit more of a shape up there. Just so it jumps about a bit less. That's okay. And then we'll just tweak that. So as you can see, you can tweak as much as you want, as often as you want. Looks pretty good. Now, just because that bottom bit's really distracting, what I'm going to do is grab my V on the keyboard, draw a box over a section of the drawing and hit delete. That's going to give us a nice hard shape on the bottom. And I'm going to do that for each frame, just roughly in the same place. So it's slightly less distracting for us. We can focus on the actual edge that we want to focus on. Okay, let's add a new layer on top, and we'll just hit F7 on every other frame to create the same keyframing as we've got on the layer beneath it. On this layer, I'm going to start to add these little shapes around the edge here. So just bringing in a little bit of extra motion and this idea of like bleeding between the colors that you can see on this original sketch here, like so. We're going to go through and do that on all the frames. So I'm just hitting full stop to pan forward and backwards, and just roughly, again, trying to copy what these shapes look like. If you're having trouble drawing at certain angles, you can press H or Shift H to bring up the rotation tool, which will rotate your canvas around so that you can draw more accurately. This combined with the space bar to pan is actually really quite useful. So you can hit H to pan, Shift H to rotate, and then H again to pan. And we'll just make these shapes somewhat the same on each frame. So rotate the canvas there, spacebar to move it, go back to the brush with B. Just because your hand obviously prefers drawing at a particular angle. So you might find it a bit more comfortable. I'm being fairly rough with this. You can obviously take as much time as you want, but you don't really want to see me just drawing over and over the same line. What I've done for a shortcut as well is I've taken my fluid brush off of Shift B and changed the shortcut for that to be just B. You can do that quite easily in the preferences. I don't think I need to show you how to do that. If you want to get back to normal, by the way, as well, on this rotation tool up here, you can just click rotation up here. I think if you double click it, it will rotate back to the standard rotation. So you don't have to worry about it being squiff forever, basically. So there we go. We have our basic shapes. We're going to add a new layer on top. Again, hitting F7 to add in some blank keyframes. And now we're going to bring in these lighter shapes that you can see on our reference sketch that overlap from the previous layer. We'll do these now because it will just save us a bit of time later on, basically. So we're back inside here, go to our brush tool, but now we go back up to our palette and we select the next lighter color. So this is the color that we've already got. Select our lighter one here, and just inside our sun, just a little bit on each frame, we're just going to bring in some of that light as if it's leaking over the shape. And because we've done it on its own layer, the onion skin is going to be really clear and obvious for us, which is good. And we can just start to fill out these shapes a little bit. Let's look at that. That looks pretty good to me. So if we drop out of our canvas and go back to scene 1, we can double click our rotation up here. We can see now that our little sun is going to keep jingling about. Oops, we've got our looping turned on still. We'll turn that off. Our little sun's going to keep jingling about in the background there for the rest of the animation until it reaches the end of the timeline. So we've named this one Sky, correct? Now, because we probably won't be moving these at all in this main timeline, we can have more than one symbol on the same layer, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw the next shape here and carry on that process that I just did, exactly the same, but for the rest of the sky. I'll do that in time lapse so that this video isn't a million hours long, and then I'll drop back out once we've got that done. One thing I will say, however, if you don't put something into a symbol, you'll notice the symbol will always be on top of any loose shape that you've got on your layer. If you have many symbols though, you can arrange them however you like, just with the normal arrange, bring to front, center back, that sort of thing. So we'll pop that sun back where he was. There. And we'll draw our next section of sky using that same color that's leaking into the sun there, with just a big swooping arc. If you're not happy, again, you could use the shape tool to do this. And I'll just show you that as well. Also, if you hold shift, it will lock your paintbrush to an axis, which is a nice way to do a clean bottom section there. But if you go over to your shape tool and you can just draw a circle, holding shift will make a perfect circle. If you've got a stroke down here though, you will have to delete that stroke. And then of course you can use the transform tools to line that up to the shape that you want. And you can use that as a bit of a shortcut. I just quite like the hand-drawn look. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I'm going to turn this one into a symbol once I'm happy with its basic shape, which I think I am. Maybe we'll have this come down a bit smoother, but of course it will be behind a hill, so it probably doesn't actually matter. And we'll just have that be roughly the same height of the sun. Let's hit F8. We'll call this one, what do I call that? Sun. So let's call this one Sky Mid Graphic. And we can hit Control and open square bracket to push that back in the layer stack, or you can hit Arrange, Center Back. Oh, sorry, it's not Control. Open square, that's After Effects. It's Control plus down, which sends it back in the layer stack. My mistake. If we open up this again, you'll notice we can do the same process. I'm just going to set up all my keyframes now. And in time-lapse mode, you'll see me make this. So just dropping out the time lapse here to say that I've done the first section. As you can see here, it's got animated bits on it, jiggling around. This section I've just turned into a symbol, but haven't animated yet. What I'm going to do is take one of these blank layers, drag it underneath the sky layer and call it Sky Base. On here, what I'm going to do is just grab my rectangle tool, make sure that it's got no stroke applied, which you can do by selecting the color over here and just cancelling it out. I'm going to make sure the fill, however, is set to our light sky color, like so, because what we need to do for this bottom bit at the very edges of the drawing here, we don't need to animate that because this orange one will be the last animated section. So what we'll do is on this layer beneath, we'll just draw ourselves a rectangle. If we hit V and select it, we can do the positioning size exactly. So we can say width 2560. Height 1440, just fill the whole background with it. X0, Y0. And that will fill the entire background of our page here. What we can do then is lock and hide it because we don't need it for now. But when we finish animating the rest of this, that'll be our background, basically. Okay, so back to the animation. Okay, so jumping back up to scene 1 and turning our background on, we can see that we've got our sort of dancing animated sky background. What I'm going to do is grab my sketch layer and just drag that to the top, however. And I'm going to turn our sketch here into a symbol. Just going to hit F8. This one's going to be a graphic and we're just going to call it background. The reason that I can do this is so that I can then reduce the opacity of it by going to Color Effects Alpha and dragging that down. And it will just allow us to see our sketch ever so slightly over the top of our drawn footage so that we can see how that looks in relation to the rest of the content that we're creating. That looks pretty good. The sky, I'm happy with that. Again, I would have spent a lot more time on it if this was for my own project, but as this is just for the tutorial, I'm kind of not rushing through it, but I'm definitely spending less time than I usually would. We're going to add the C in now, just so that we don't have this ugly, crappy bottom of our line here. And that's going to have a similar animation process to what we've done for the dancing sky here, but I want them to move a bit slower and smoother. So we're going to use something called tweening to do that, shape tweening. Hopefully it'll work. It's a bit temperamental. So we're going to, on this layer above our sky and sky base, we'll make a new layer called Ocean. And for this one, we will just use a rectangle because we can just tweak it. We will grab our ocean color, which is the lightest of our 3 greens. And I'm just going to drag myself a square that roughly lines up. You can see in the original script that it wasn't exactly a straight line. So that's good, because what we can do with our shape is bend it to our will, like so. If you wanted to add in a little bit of, let's hide our sketch layer just so we can click this, add in a little bit of curvature if you wanted to, which I think we do. That looks pretty good. Now we only see this bit of the ocean, so I'm not going to bother drawing any bits over here. I'm just going to add some nice effects to this. So again, we'll hit F8, turn this into a symbol called ocean. And inside that symbol, oops, excuse me, clicked on the wrong layer there. Hide that sketch again. Inside this symbol, we'll add some lines on top of it that look like our ocean. So just to reference what that's going to look like, essentially, we're going to have a few lines along the top here and then some sort of wavy lines just in the sea in this rough middle area. So what we can do is drop inside our ocean, create a new layer. And as you can see, you can kind of still see the sketch from behind. So what we'll do is we'll grab our dark color here. And on the new layer above, we'll just draw a guideline of where we can roughly see. So it'll be somewhere around there will be the visible type of our ocean area. So we'll just overshoot a little bit. We'll lock this layer and we'll click this little option here, which turns just the outlines on. So we can clearly see that it's not something we've drawn. Then if we add in a bunch of frames using F5, that'll help us. And we can rename this layer guide. Okay, so this is going to be the base of our ocean. So we'll rename that base. And on top of it, we'll add in the ocean lines that we want to be static. So I'll grab our second darkest ocean color, hit B, hit Shift H to rotate because I prefer drawing downwards. And then I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. Oops, excuse me. And I'm just going to the edge of the ocean here. I'm just going to draw in some little green lines that start and stop. Just to add in, oops, excuse me, I messed that one up. Just to add in a little bit extra contrast between this and the sky. If you mess up ever so slightly, you can just select it with the select tool and then move that up and down until you're happy, which I think I am. So I'll see what that looks like. Okay, that looks okay. So the hill's going to come in there. The hill's going to come in there. That's pretty good. So that one we will leave static, I think. Unless on this one, we'll do the same that we did before. I'll hit F7 on 2 frames along, and I will just fill 4 frames, which will then loop of this kind of edge water shimmering. It should look pretty cool. So, oops, that one didn't actually draw, did it? There we go. F7 there. To just start filling these in. A bit hard to see when the colors are very similar. But that's okay. Shimmering effects here look pretty good. And here also. Okay, so with those 4 frames, I imagine what we're going to do inside this symbol is going to take more than 4 frames. So for these 4, I'm just going to select them all, including an extra frame at the end, and holding Alt, I'm going to drag them so that they repeat over and over again. And then we'll see what that looks like. Just because inside of this particular symbol, we're probably going to do other stuff that's going to last longer than those 8 frames. So that rippling looks quite good. Let's see what this looks like. I haven't done it before. So on one layer, I'm going to draw myself a nice long ripple. Something like that. Okay. Smoothed out a bit too much. So what we might actually do for this one is just turn the stabilization down briefly, which will allow some of my shaky handness to come back in. That looks pretty good. Then on say, well, let's just make it this, frame 48. Let's add a new keyframe that is blank, F7. Okay. Then we're going to try and draw this exactly the same again, as close as possible. And it'll obviously be slightly different because we've turned the stabilization down. Now I've drawn it slightly different. I'm going to move it along just a little bit, maybe down a little bit as well. And I'm just going to then zoom in. And we're just going to ever so slightly make some minor tweaks, just really small ones. Now, to draw each of these, if we wanted this to be the first shape and this to be the second shape, to draw each of those really smoothly would be very difficult. So what we're going to do is something called tweening, where the computer does that for us. If you click anywhere between the first and two keyframes, right click and choose shape tween. A shape tween will apply to any of these shape layers that we've got here. If you wanted to classic tween one symbol to another symbol, you'd have to use the classic tween, but you wouldn't obviously be able to animate that frame by frame because the symbol itself isn't editable. So you'd use that to move a symbol from one position to the other, but not squish or like redraw it or anything. You could squish it, just couldn't redraw it. Let's hit shape tween and see if that works. Not too bad, actually. I'm used to it not working at all. Let's see what it looks like on the real thing here. All right, that looks pretty good. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to add in some keyframes here now that we know it's working. And we're going to change the last keyframes to the same color as the ocean. Okay, because we obviously need this to loop. So it's going to come in and fade out again. Fade in and fade out again. Okay, pretty happy with that. So what I'm going to do now is select all of these keyframes, right click and choose convert to keyframes. And what that will do is change each one of these to an individual keyframe that we can then edit, because you see how that's going really smoothly and the rest is kind of janky. That's because this is animating now on every keyframe, which it was doing when it was a tween as well. Now we can go through and clear each of these keyframes like so. Takes a little while. So you can just use the shortcut Shift F6 instead. Like this, keep going. And you'll notice that each time I do this, it turns it into a normal frame. But because we've got the shape tween applied, it applies a little arrow just to indicate that it is still tweening. It is still changing. To fix that, let's leave that one. To fix that, we can just grab all these layers, right click, remove shape tween. Now it looks exactly like our last one, and it's a bit more janky, yeah, which is quite nice. So now when we go back to our main scene, main ocean scene, and we zoom out a little bit, we turn off our sketch, we can see that we have our waves that come in and go out on a loop. Now, if you wanted to, you can do that for as many ways as you want. I'm going to do it by hand just because I quite like the way that looks, but that's just a quick introduction to how tweening works inside of symbols and stuff like that. You can leave it on the shape tween, absolutely. I just like it to be a little bit more janky than that in this particular style. So what I'm going to do is delete this layer and I'm going to do it all by hand. I am going to fast forward through that because it will just take forever. So I'll see you on the other side. One thing to note is that I'm putting each cluster of these little waves on its own layer, just because I find it easier to work that way if you want to come through and edit something a bit later on. So for example, this section of lines here is on its own layer and this section of lines here is on its own layer, just because it's a bit neater, it's a bit easier to work with, and you've got less chance of things going wrong if you need to come back and change something later. One thing you will need to note is once you've done all your little animation bits, which I think I'm quite happy with, you will need to hide your guide layer even though it's outlined, because if you don't, when you drop back to your main scene, it will still be visible in there, which you don't want. So just double click to get inside that ocean layer and hide that layer so that when you drop out, Oh, it's still there. Silly. That might be a setting. Hello everyone, post-editing Matt here. Just a quick one to say that I'm an idiot. You just go to Publish Settings and uncheck this option for Include Hidden Layers. Let's delete the layer. I think there's a setting in your preferences somewhere, because this is a fresh copy, that says don't show hidden layers. So we'll just delete it for now. Uncheck Include Hidden Layers. And I'll see if I can figure out what that is between now and next episode. Uncheck Include Hidden Layers. So you can see we've got our background and it's looking pretty good, if you do say so myself. We turn the sketch back on, we can see how that's going to sit in relation to the rest of our content. Let's turn our alpha up a little bit as well, just on this layer. Oops. Make sure that's selected on the object, not the layer itself. Otherwise, you'll apply a different type of alpha. So you can see how our waves there kind of match up with our waves in our over main timeline. I might come back through and add a few more later on. Maybe not, though. We'll see. Let's work on the boat, because this one's going to be its own little collection of layers, which will be quite interesting to animate. And then we'll continue to work on the rest of these layers. We'll come back and do the clouds, I think. How long is this episode already? This is already 50 minutes long. Wow. Let's do the boat, and then we'll come back and we'll do the rest of this in the next episode as well. It's going to be a long series. Okay, so we have our ocean. Let's do a boat layer. Now we're going to do this one slightly differently. I'm going to zoom into the boat, like so. Oh, really far. And I'm just going to draw some reference shapes quickly. In a small brush, make sure we turn our smoothing back up. Just going to draw some shapes for the boat. I'm not going to worry about getting them right at the moment, because this will just act as a guide, because we want to split some of these out onto their own layers. There we go. So let's select that first keyframe, which selects everything on that frame on the boat layer. Let's hit F8 and we'll turn this into boat graphic. And then we can drop inside it. Let's hide that and go inside. Okay, so we've got our boat. Each of these separate elements probably should be on its own layer if you're going to want them to be animated, which we do, just so it's a little bit easier for you to work with. So we'll grab some layers, we'll hit F5, and we'll call this boat base. We'll call this, what's that word called? The thing that's the Crotech mast. There we go. And we'll call this sails. Okay, sweet. So let's outline our bottom layer, unlock it, and let's start drawing in our little boat. So we'll grab that middle sky color. I think is going to work quite well. We're going to turn our brush size down, which we've done, and we're just going to draw in the entire base of the boat with nice, smooth options. So we're going to do like so. Now I know it's got a wobbly bottom, but we're not going to draw that wobbly bottom. We're going to draw the whole thing and then hide it with a shape layer later on. So this is our first boat. What we're going to do, however, is draw the whole thing and then sort of like bob it up and down in different ways. So selecting what we've just drawn, because we're not going to have to redo each of these frames, I'm going to choose my darker color. Oops, like so. Excuse me. I'm going to choose my darker color first. Select our shape layer. And change our brush type in the options up here to paint within. So we've got tool. There we go. Under the tools palette, we're going to change this brush mode here from paint normal to paint selection. What that's going to do is make sure that when we draw something, it only appears within the selection that we have already selected. And I'm going to use that to my advantage to just fill in the inside, or what we'd consider the inside of the boat. Just going to grab my lighter color neaten up that edge there so that it aligns slightly more with what I think is the edge of the boat. Looks pretty good. Then I'm going to turn back to my normal and I'm just going to smooth out whatever that was that just happened there. Don't know what that was. We'll fix it though. There we go. Oops, I messed that bit up, so we'll just fix that. Lots of fixing things back and forth in Animate. There we go. So, little bottom of our boat that we are happy with. Seems pretty good to me. Now we need to draw the mast. Now the mast I'm actually probably going to put on the same layer because I want the sails to sort of flap because they'd be separate to the mast, but the mast would move with the boat. So we'll grab a dark color for the mast, maybe this dark purple. We'll select just this dark section and then we'll hit B. We'll go to our tool and we'll change to paint selection. And that will allow us to just draw there with a nice harsh line. We can then deselect, press B again, go back to paint normal, and just draw the rest of the mast. There, that looks pretty good. Okay, so on a separate layer now, for the sails, we're going to draw in some sails, believe it or not. Let's draw them in this sort of light color here. Or do we want them to be this kind of white? Let's test. Let's draw with the white and see what that looks like outside of the symbol against the ocean. Fill that in with K. Drop out of our option here. And I think that's going to be, probably can't really see that against the ocean there. So we will color it in this kind of sky color, because then when you drop out, you will see it. Okay. Quickly draw in the other sail here. Bit taller, bit shorter. Okay, that looks good. So we've got our boat. We can now delete our guide layer. Boom. So let's go back to normal rotation. On top of this, I'm going to create a new layer. Call this ocean. Grab our normal ocean color. And I'm just going to draw in a little wave. Beep, beep, beep. Now that's going to cut out the bottom of the boat. Now, it'll probably be best if we added even just a little bit of animation to this boat wave. Oops, excuse me. So I'm just hitting F7 here. And we're just going to loop in just a few frames where it does move just a little bit. Like that. Okay. Just so we've got a little bit of motion on the top of the wave there. Again, the bottom doesn't matter because it's the same color as the wave beneath it. That'll do for that many frames. So we'll just make sure that that loops nicely. Good. Now the whole thing's going to be moving in a minute. So whilst that looks slightly janky, what we can do is see in the real thing that that looks okay. Yeah. Accidentally on top of that little wave section there, so we can move that. We can check what that's still like on the sketch. Looks pretty okay. So we can position it wherever you want. Back inside the layer then, let's zoom in. And I'm going to just have this boat sort of bob up and down in place. Okay. So we're going to grab the boat base and the boat sails. And we're going to hit F6 and then Q. And that's going to bring up the transform controls for both of these. We're going to rotate it slightly to the right and move it ever so slightly down. Then we'll do the same thing again. F6, slightly to the right, but a bit more down. So it's kind of bobbing a bit deeper. Then F6, we'll rotate it just a little bit and move it down just a little bit. Then we'll just have one where it goes down just literally a few frames. So we've got this. It's kind of speeding up, then easing into it motion. Oops, one thing is the bottom of the boat does poke out of our shape on some of these frames. This last one, look. So what we'll do is we'll actually redo this layer in a second if we just delete that. So we've got our boat bobbing down. I'm going to have it hold there for a little bit. Just create a new frame just because. And then we'll have him come back up, but first he'll come back up in slightly different, won't he? He'll rotate just a little bit, come back up just a little bit. F6 again, rotate a little bit, come back up a bit more. Then as it reaches its zenith, it's going to rotate just a touch, come up just a touch. Now I'm going to grab my first 2 frames, which are here, and I'm going to, holding Alt, drag them over until I can add in a new set of keyframes here, which is equal between them. Now when I select this, I know that these last 2 keyframes are the same as these first 2 keyframes, which means that these need to match up to create a perfect loop. So we'll just ease in. I'll maybe need an extra easer there. So we'll just create some more space, hit F6, and we'll just make sure that settles in nicely, like so. And we'll take a look at that. So we'll remove these layers now, these extra frames, sorry, so that we've got just the perfect loop. Bloop, bloop, bloop. Let's add in a quick loop so we can see it moving up and down. So that creates a nice little bobbing loop, okay? Seems good to me. So it's time now to create the little wave that's going to mask out the bottom of our boat here. So to do that, we'll create a layer on top, and we're going to just draw everything that we want to show. Now, this may seem backwards, but this is the way that Adobe Animate does it. So basically, I'm going to draw a shape over the top of everything that I want to be visible on this boat. And everything that this shape covers is going to be visible when we turn this into a mask. For example, if I drag this above the boat base layer, because we don't care about the sails, we can then hit mask. And what that's going to do is you can notice it's going to chop off, if we unlock it, it's going to chop off that section of the boat there. So that when this guy starts bobbing around, he's going to start bobbing around into the ocean. Now we're going to add a little bit of animation to this by just hitting F7. Turning onion skin on, which I turned off. Draw something that's roughly the same, but with a slightly different bottom edge. We don't really care about the rest of the edges. Do that a few times, and then we'll loop these frames. So, like so. One more. And the reason you have to do it this way is because you can't inverse a mask without turning it into a movie clip and doing a bunch of other stuff inside of Adobe Animate. So we're doing it this way, which looks messy, but once the mask is turned on, it doesn't obviously matter. So we will grab all of these, duplicate the frames, and then lock again, so that when we see our looping animation, we've got it going there. And that's the Amazon man. Be right back. And there we have our little bobbing boat. Pretty happy with that. So let's drop out of our symbol and see what that looks like in our main timeline. Let's go to show frame, and we can see. Oops, I've still got the looping turned on again, so we'll turn that off. And we can see, here's our little boat bobbing along in the ocean. It's kind of janky on one frame there, so let's see what that looks like. Why it's doing that. If we just control to zoom in. Which frame is it that's being really janky? I think it's the first one. Yeah, it's because all the frames go down, look, and then it jumps right back up for this next frame. So what we'll do is on this 4th frame, we'll just shift that up a little bit. It'll be 1, 2, 3, 4. That's where it loops again. So we'll shift that up a little bit. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's where it loops again. And we'll shift up a little bit. Now that should look a little bit smoother. Yeah, that looks okay. So we'll turn that mask on. Yeah, that loops quite well now. All right, wicked. So drop back out of here. Zoom back out. Now we obviously want this guy to travel across the screen a little bit. And that's simple. We'll just do that one with a motion tween. So if I'm going to grab this keyframe on the last of our frame of our timeline here, hit F6, and then I'm just going to move him across the ocean just a little bit. Not too much because I don't want it to be too distracting. I'm going to right click any of the frames in between it and just hit classic tween. And what that's going to do is it's going to guess what I want that to do for the rest of the frame. And it's guessed correctly, just slowly drift across the ocean there. Okay. Now we could do what we did earlier and turn this to keyframes and break every other one. But I'm not super bothered about that because it looks janky enough as it's moving anyway. So that looks pretty good to me. Turn our sketch back on and see what we're working with. If I go to my sketch layer here and just reduce the opacity down a little bit, it's a bit too bright for me. And we can see that we're doing pretty good. All right. I think that's more than enough for episode 1. This is going to be a big, big series. So in episode 2, we'll work on the clouds and the hills and stuff like that, as well as the river and the house, because that's all going to be pretty much static. Then we'll take a look at doing the trees, which we're going to have some cool animation on where the branches wiggle about. And then the final episode will probably be on this little bird down here, who's going to be the most complicated part, because I want him to sort of move his head around, crouch down, and then start to flap off across the screen. So don't know how these episodes are going to be structured, but hopefully you guys just enjoy following along and seeing if we can create this little animation together. So I really do appreciate it, guys. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time on the next episode of TipTut.
Remember to subscribe for more tips, tricks, and tutorials. Thanks for watching.